Hello, Americans. This is Chad Hardy, and this is the Keeping It Real podcast. This weekend was a most special weekend. It was a weekend that we celebrated a small baby shower for the latest addition to my family. Ordinarily, if we were to welcome a new Hardy to this family, it would be a baby shower of baby showers. For this will be the first time since 2004 that we've added a member to my immediate family. Prior to that, in 1996, a member of this family was brought into the world, Killian Hardy, my son, who is now bringing his own son into this world.
Sir.
And we had the baby shower this weekend. It was fantastic.
It was amazing.
It would be the kind of baby shower that would, well, quite frankly, you might be able to see it from space. And I am beyond thrilled to become a grandpa here in the coming months of October. My son had a few close friends that came into town to celebrate his fatherhood, and his beautiful girlfriend also had a few close friends come into town to try and plan such an event. With just a few close friends during these trying times was difficult, to say the least. Trying to balance the very fine line of social distancing protocols and wearing a face mask, where to stay, where to have it. There were so many that we just couldn't invite. I now understand the plight of parents of whom children graduated this last year with no graduation. I feel the pain of parents of whom children had planned weddings this spring and had to cancel or modify their dream. Or the mother whom gave birth in the hospital alone. Or, as my mind wandered, I thought of the loved ones who suffered through having COVID in a hospital, no visitors, no family, some of who died alone. And not to mention the family members still grieving the unfortunate deaths of those loved ones who they could not touch one last time or hold a hand one last time. It's in these moments of where we try to exercise our liberties and what we took for granted in the past as normalcy suddenly becomes an almost dark reality. The world has most certainly changed. And as the sadness wore off and I gleamed at my beaming son and the mother glowing and smiling at him as they experienced a moment both will cherish forever. In celebrating the birth of their child, my grandson, my mother's first great-grandchild, my nieces and nephew's first cousin, whom of all which are so delighted. It was emotional. It was special. It was back to some kind of normalcy, celebrating with a few close family members and friends. And then a different kind of sadness came over me. And it wasn't a sadness at all. I started looking into the future, and it became an emotion of anger that I had never felt. As I started to look at those numbers again, going over the scenario in my head of how this happened, how we got here, how the reason went by the wayside and panic and fear took over, as our media poured it on like hot syrup over a bed of pancakes and it just absorbed so quickly. Then thinking, as if in fast-forward mode again, what it's going to be like in 5 years when my grandson will be celebrating his 5th birthday. I remember my son so well. He wanted a bike, he wanted a dog, he wanted chocolate cake. And when you look back on it, it just seemed so much simpler then. We picked up the phone or we put a card in the mail and said, "Come on over, we're having a party." Many close friends came and we celebrated that day, and they brought their children without a second thought. And he got both a bike and a dog. Of course he did. Now, not only do we have to worry about if anyone will come over, or if we should even have a party, and who should we not invite, because God forbid we have too many people. But we also have to worry about our 5-year-old children now being shot in the head for riding a bike on a lawn.
5-year-old boy, Cannon Hinnant, was murdered this past Sunday, executed by a monster named Darius Sessoms, who put a gun to Cannon's head while Cannon was riding his bike in his dad's front yard, pulled the trigger, and murdered Cannon in front of his 7- and 8-year-old sisters.
You heard right. A man, if you can even call this piece of shit a man, pulled out a gun and shot this 5-year-old boy in the head in front of his 2 sisters, aged 7 and 8. And you'd think all of America would be outraged right now. And Killian were not. I didn't see this on the mainstream media. I saw it on Facebook.
That's where I saw it.
I saw it. And then I'm looking through and I'm seeing that, well, they're not running it.
The mainstream media, including NBC News, ABC News, and the New York Times and others, literally did not air one segment or publish one story talking about this murder.
Because the part of the story The part of the story there you didn't hear? Here's the real truth of the matter and why our politically correct new America is not outraged and why very few people even know about this.
A 25-year-old black man walked out of his house, went up to a little white boy who was 5 years old. He was riding his bicycle with his two sisters, doing nothing. Walked up to him, took out his gun, put it to his fucking head, and pulled the trigger.
And I don't have to tell you what would be happening in this country right now if the headline read like this. A 25-year-old white man walked out of his apartment today and shot a 5-year-old little black boy in the head, while his two black sisters watched on. Am I right?
You're absolutely
What would be happening?
City would be burning down worldwide. I mean, cities across the nation would be up in arms.
Right?
Against this
We'd
tragedy.
be hearing about this story over and over again on the mainstream media, would be all over it. Every city in this country would be being looted and burned to the ground right now.
Absolutely.
Hey, try and tell me different. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're black or white. We can all agree on that.
This story would be running wild, and they would be connecting it somehow, some way, back to the systemic racism that's in this country, propagated by your president.
And yet, we're not going to see this little boy's funeral on TV. And this is not anything else except for an attack and letting you understand just how biased our media is.
I'd like to reiterate that point that this is not a black versus white thing. No matter how much the media wants to portray that narrative, that this is a way of keeping us divided, perpetrating a narrative that incites divisiveness and violence and separation and mistrust between American citizens. And that's an important thing that we all have to remember, is that when certain actions are taken by the media or certain stories portrayed in certain lights, not only does it create divisiveness, but it also hurts the real life issues that surround the black community. It hurts the real life issues surrounding minorities in this country. Okay? It doesn't help those individuals. It hinders them. And it just goes to show how far the media outlets and certain entities in this country will go to create that narrative that ultimately is a form of pandering. And it's disgusting, because all it tells me is that they don't actually care about the liberation of black struggle. They don't actually care about the liberation of certain persecutions that members of this country face. And all they care about is how it affects their political agenda and what they want to have happen in this country.
Well said. And that has been I'll tell you what, over this whole Democratic convention this last week, this is every one of the speeches.
We are confronting systemic racism.
Systemic racism.
Systemic racism.
Racist president.
Racial justice.
Racial justice.
Systemic racial injustice.
Fight systemic racism.
Racial injustice. Racial justice.
Racial justice.
Racial violence.
Racial justice.
Donald Trump praised those racists.
Structural racism.
Systemic racism.
Racial bias.
Racial inequities.
Racism.
Structural racism.
We only react to how the media tells us to these days. And it's sad. So if they don't report on it or fuel us with an anger or fear, then we don't react.
The rest of you who have any sense of just normalcy see this as being the most hypocritical crime of our year.
Now, some who knew where I was going and I was going to talk about this on the podcast are, are you sure you want to go there? Yes, I do. I'm not afraid to talk about the truth. It's a little uncomfortable. Yeah? Well, so is not talking about it. So let's all get a little uncomfortable for a minute. Be rational adults here. Set this other political bullshit aside and let's talk about this, because enough is enough. And I'm not afraid to speak the damn truth. And I wouldn't expect you to ever listen to this podcast again if I were to avoid this subject because I was uncomfortable. It's what's happening. And I refuse to be bullied into a corner by the radical left or anybody from the right for speaking the truth, for standing up for facts. And if you don't think this is being fueled by China and Russia, you need to think again. You need to wake up. Because they're across the pond instigating this stuff, probably sending people in to even incite some of this violence. Definitely hitting us on social media with it. This has been going on for a long time. This is a clip from a documentary in 1962. This is real, legit stuff here.
As early as 1928, the communists declared that the racial differences among our people constituted the weakest and most vulnerable point in our social fabric. By constantly probing and straining at this one spot, they calculated that eventually the cloth could be torn apart and that Americans could be divided, weakened, and perhaps even set against each other in open combat. We mustn't kid ourselves into thinking that the communists have placed their agitators only into the black communities. They're working both sides of the street. They want hatred, violence, and bloodshed between the races, and they don't care how they get it or whom they use.
It's time to catch our collective breaths and say, how does a country who just elected a black man president for 2 terms all of a sudden become a nation full of racists?
It's so interesting because, America never seemed to care before about the racial injustices surrounding this country until it became a mode for them to take advantage of the political narrative. And I think that that's so sad. So what you're telling me is that Black lives only matter when it's suitable to help your election process, when it's suitable to put a candidate in the office that is right for your agenda. That's when Black lives matter. Okay, I understand now. You don't actually care about real racial injustice. What you care about is exploiting racial injustice in order to create a divided nation so that you may move your political agenda forward. And that is disgusting. Taking advantage of someone's detriment, families, generations of hatred and prejudice. I would prefer somebody who is open and honest about their egregious behaviors than somebody who pretends to be a hero and wears a mask, pun not intended, in order to try and manipulate the system so that they can push forward whatever agendas that they have.
Absolutely correct. We're not going to see this little boy's funeral on CNN or Fox. We're not going to hear about it. And it's sad for the family because no one's going to hear their rage because the media will be silent about it. There will be no calls for justice. There will be no marches for your child. Your child would barely be mentioned.
If you say all lives matter, you don't understand the gravity of the issue. If you were to say Latino lives matter, or if you were to say Asian lives matter, you don't get the point. And if you were to say white lives matter, you're a fucking racist.
And even if that child is black, because if it isn't a white man killing a black man, then it isn't news. And don't think that Black Lives Matter is coming to the rescue of black children, because here's Terry Crews.
When you look in the city of Chicago, there are 9 children who died by gun violence, by black on black gun violence from June 20th all the way to today. And you're talking about even with the Atlanta child murders, there were 28 kids who died in 2 years. You're talking about a month, and you have 9 black kids, and the Black Lives Matter movement has said nothing.
So by now, since it's been a full week, you've heard about this story because it's so egregious, as is the completely one-sided narrative that the mainstream media is spreading, and many are waking up. Yes, I saw your posts. I did see a lot of people speaking out on Facebook more than I have. And this is a very touchy subject, Gillian. So for people to actually be saying, all right, I'm not going to let this go by. Some people are waking up. I see it a lot more. While few and far between, I did see some of you did wake up and spoke up. And not just for this little boy, but for the other innocent victims of all this senseless violence. Black Lives Matter seems to cherry pick some black lives to matter more than others if it fits the narrative and it fits the media's script for them.
And that's the worst part for me. If you care about something, care about it off of altruistic sensibilities, altruistic principles. Don't care about something if it fits your agenda. That's emotional manipulation, and that's not okay.
It's so outrageously obvious that the media bias spoke so loud by not covering this story that those who were sleeping heard that alarm and spoke up. And one of my guys, Anna Malley, finally said this.
So next time they yell at you for saying all lives matter, understand why. All lives literally don't matter to them. Little kid lives don't matter, and all black lives don't even matter. What they care about is when a white cop interacts with a black person, and they could twist it to start chaos, anger, and riots.
Must we embrace this new normal and continue to let a group of television and media companies aligned with the political